All right. Okay, sorry. I have your quizzes. I'll get them back before class ends today. There's a baby looking at its brain, or a brain. What is Churchland up to? If you recall her reading, she is an eliminativist. That's a weird word. She's a eliminative materialist. Sometimes the word physicalist is used. In fact, currently the word physicalism is used more often to refer to a monist view. A monist view of the world has to do with there being one kind of stuff. And in this case, for most materialist/physicalist, that stuff is physical. The modern philosophical period spoke of materialism. All that exists are stuff, matter. With the development of contemporary science starting in the 1910s and 20s, what constituted subject matter of physics, what constitutes as the physical, was expanded. You can think of matter being a subset of the physical. Think about energy. That is physical, but it's not clear that it is material in the common sense notion. And so we think of a physicalist instead of a materialist. For our purposes, they roughly mean the same thing, but you see why that name has changed. If you see in any of the readings, differences between them. Now, Churchland wants to get rid of. She wants to rid science of certain types of language that she equates with folk psychology. Have you heard this phrase, folk psychology? What is folk psychology? She means it negatively. It's a pejorative. What's folk psychology in the negative sense? What's that? Do they do? It's oftentimes is dualistic, but that's not in itself problematic for her. Well, it is problematic for her, but that. Yes, go ahead.
Psychology that relies on less empirical facts and more on subjective.
That, yes. Think of it also, maybe pop psychology is another term that's sometimes used, but you have folk psychological language where we have some sense of what is true of human nature by popular psychological studies that you read headlines about, and then you start to use that language in a similar way. Do you have a question?
No, it wasn't a question.
Oh. Comment?
It was pretty much what you were saying.
So I was correct?
Yes.
Well, it's a negative. She wants to get rid of words, certainly get rid of soul. Even mind, it's not clear what that refers to. And in some cases, if you go back to experience, if you go back to some of the people who she reveres, Churchland, and her husband, Paul Churchland, I almost said her husband and father. That's not what clearly that's not what I meant. I don't even know why I said that. I almost said that. You wouldn't have known that I almost said that if I hadn't told you. I apologize. Mind, experience, soul. Experience is oftentimes synonymous with consciousness, because after all, can you have a non-conscious experience? I guess. Although isn't that contradictory? Yeah?
Well, non-conscious meaning you're dead?
No, because trees are not dead, but I suspect they're not conscious. Although, wait a minute, have I spoken too soon? And don't tell me studies about how trees communicate with other trees and are conscious in their communication because of the chemicals that get passed underneath in the roots, and they're talking to each other. And like saying, hey, we got to run, there's poison coming. Yeah, but we're rooted, we can't leave. This is the trees talking. They don't do that. They may pass chemicals, and I think that's fascinating. That's amazing. Is it consciousness? That's at the other end. That's at the other end of our discussion for today. So I'm going to come back to it, believe it or not. Yes.
So would non-conscious be synonymous with unconscious?
Great question. I don't want to get too much into that. Freud came along and just made things so confusing. There's unconscious, non-conscious, subconscious, proto-conscious. There's a number of terms. You can say non-conscious as if it's, inert objects, inanimate objects that cannot become conscious. Then there's subconscious or unconscious, where we could be knocked unconscious. That doesn't mean we're not going to come back, right? I'll talk about that with anesthesiologists. The anesthesiologist is knocking you, rendering you unconscious. Hopefully, they'll bring you back. And usually they do. But I'll have to preface this with, they don't know what they're doing, the anesthesiologists. And I don't mean that like metaphorically. They don't know what consciousness is. So, because nobody does. I'll get to that too. Yes?
Well, when you said that last bit about knowing what consciousness is, I'm kind of worried we'll be able to answer. But
okay, we'll see.
Is it referred to like dissociative states where like you're in a situation and all of a sudden you hear yourself respond to a question that you know you're asked? Kind of situation,
Oh.
Well,
that's almost an out-of-body kind of experience.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that kind of study stopped in science around the time of a little bit after William James, B.F. Skinner. Psychologists come along and say, we need to study what we can observe. Mental states are not observable. They didn't like Wittgenstein's view, the later Wittgenstein. They're not observable, they're not reliable, they're not quantifiable. We need to study only that which is quantifiable, or else it's not real science. Skinner, notice, didn't say there's no such thing as consciousness. It's just, I don't know how to evaluate it, I don't know how to quantify it, I don't know how to study it, and so science isn't the right tool to investigate that. Philosophers, influenced largely by the logical positivists, then come along and extend that to saying, well, you know what? Maybe we ought to eventually eliminate these concepts because they're like that word I gave you last time, phlogiston and ether. Phlogiston and ether that we don't use. Scientists don't use these terms. There's probably a bunch of others if you take a history of science class. Which, by the way, do your science classes, if you're getting a degree in science, do you take history of science classes to get a degree in science? No. Is that weird?
Is it just because they're trying not to introduce like scientific principles that have already been discarded?
How do they get discarded? Most of science is discarding.
Yeah.
Maybe it'll be useful, and this is relevant to our discussion here. It seems if I want to major in science, I want to know what the history is. I want to know where the failures are, because most of the successes come from recognizing prior failures. To not have a history of science class and be a science major seems mistaken, I'll just say. And it's understandable. You don't want, I'm not going to go, I hope, to med school and learn about, what Galen thought about headaches and then apply that to today. But it's beneficial to see the mistakes that were made and why they were made in the past and how they were fixed, because then we might be able to progress and not make the same damn mistakes, which happens not just in science, not just in history, not just in politics, but it happens in science as well. And at the time that Churchland is writing, this is mid-90s, there had already been a number of, there had been most of the 20th century, of moving away from studies of first-person consciousness experience. She thinks that maybe we ought to bring this back into something that's worthy of study because it's hard to dismiss. It's hard to dismiss that there is a first-person conscious experience. Her key claim is, I am predicting that the explanatory power, the coherence, and economy, these are all virtues of scientific theorizing, hypotheses, right? Coherence, explanatory power, parsimony, or Occam's razors, which he means by economy here, will favor the hypothesis that awareness, and here she means conscious awareness. I suspect we might distinguish the two, as Chalmers does in his article. He makes a distinction between awareness and consciousness, right? Is just, notice, I italicize this, is some pattern of activity of neurons. It's not saying, she is not saying consciousness emerges from, consciousness is caused by. Remember her discussion of heat. She's making an identity claim. She is wholly reducing conscious experience, what it is like to be you, to patterns of neuronal activity. And in one of the suggested readings you didn't have to do, from Galen Strawson, wherein he talks about things feeling rum, as we were discussing earlier, it just means weird apparently. He argues that what's actually happening when you reduce consciousness to neuronal firing, saying it just is this, you actually get rid of consciousness. You have eliminated that which you've attempted to merely reduce. It's a complex idea. He mentions that we do in physics all the time make reductions. I can reduce biological ideas to chemical ideas, and the chemical ideas, the chemical processes, to physical processes. And then each time I'm doing that, when I reduce the chemical process to a physical process, the chemical process doesn't drop out and go away. It's explained in terms of the physical processes. Think in terms of layers. But when I take consciousness and try to reduce it to the physical, I reduce it to patterns of neuronal activity, consciousness disappears. Consciousness is not the same type of thing, if we can use that word, as chemical processes. And now, maybe we're begging the question. Is there more on this? Maybe we're begging the question. This is just for fun. I don't really mean that I don't mean this as a critique of Churchland, but it is interesting. If you remember Mad Libs, do you remember Mad Libs? Did you ever have that game? This is an example of it. I'm not going to go through it, but it's a final paper in which you utilize scientific theories to refute a particular philosophical theory. In this case, Churchland refuting some version of substance dualism. I just found it funny. I'm not going to go through it now. But you have it. You can look at it at your leisure. We're not going to do it now. So this is a brain. We're looking at philosophy of mind in general, contemporary philosophy of mind, although we'll end today with a very old theory in the philosophy of mind, going all the way back at least to people like perhaps Thales, who's considered the first philosopher in the Western tradition. But the question, where is the what and where in the world is consciousness? Where is your mind? These are fundamentally difficult questions. I forgot there's an arrow. Probably somewhere in there. And yeah, it's not very detailed. But it's not surprising that we would think that there are neural correlates to consciousness. That there are areas of the brain such that if there's damage done to them, then there are equally damaged parts of our mind. That there is a connection between, even substance dualists will accept some connection there, that there is the mental states and there are physical states. And if one of them gets damaged, say the physical parts of the brain, that may reduce our capacity to think. That may reduce our capacity to speak. I guess I should have started with this. In response to the negative view, the scientism of eliminativism, we might say something like this, where we have the history of physics. That's just kind of what I was talking about moments ago. Here's the history of physics. Aristotle said a bunch of stuff that was wrong. Well, Galileo and Newton fixed them up. Then Einstein broke it again. Now we've basically got it all worked out, except for the small stuff. That's the quantum level. The big stuff, that's the astronomical level. The hot stuff, the cold stuff, the fat stuff, the heavy stuff, the dark stuff, turbulence, and the concept of time. I may be mistaken. Maybe physicists would say, no, we got most of that. Although I suspect that's not the case. I suspect those problems, which are very difficult, are not even as hard as consciousness. And I suspect there's not even agreement among physicists. It's not one of these things where you can say, physicists agree, and then fill in the blank. You can say that with a lot. Scientists believe, and then fill in a statement, and in general, that's going to be the case. Now, you certainly can't do that with philosophy. Philosophers believe, what would you fill in which we'd say, oh yeah, they do believe that. That's true. Philosophers believe that philosophy is useful. No, they don't all agree on that. They don't even agree on what philosophy is. Philosophers, they've got their own problems.
Wait, do they all believe?
Philosophy is useless? Useful? Freudian slip.
No.
What?
Like, just in general.
In general, most philosophers would say that philosophy is useful.
No.
It's hard to disagree with that.
No, do
And
they
be
believe?
engaged in philosophy.
Do they believe?
Why would they do it if they don't believe
Do
it?
they believe what? Oh, you're saying they're just saying it, but they don't really believe it.
I don't know.
I don't know. Okay, well, yeah, I shouldn't have brought that up. There's debates about what philosophy, the purpose of it is, what it actually is. In fact, we talked about that the very first day, or second day, with Churchland. Is philosophy supposed to get to the meaning of life, the big picture type questions, or is it to get to the narrow details of of how to explain the conscious experience of a patch of red?
Can you see,
Do you see those?
philosophers like questions?
Yeah, but scientists like questions. Theologians like questions.
Or like
Most of them,
specific
most of them.
types questions?
Yeah, yes. I don't want to get too much into the... Well, we do want to say this. Churchland makes this clear. Chalmers makes this clear. You can't do contemporary philosophy of mind and ignore science. There's definitely overlap on those two. And I think, and Chalmers makes this point, and so does Churchland, if not in the reading you had elsewhere, she does, you really shouldn't be trying to do neuroscience and trying to explain consciousness without understanding some of the history of the philosophical ideas embedded within this and the philosophical presuppositions. Scientists have all sorts of presuppositions, philosophical presuppositions, metaphysical presuppositions, and they usually do not consciously think about them, and yet they affect their work. What metaphysicians are supposed to do and avoid are presuppositions going unquestioned. So what is consciousness? I think it's a fascinating question. I think it's probably the most important question in contemporary philosophy now, certainly in the philosophy of mind. It's the hottest topic in much of philosophy in general at the moment. Things may change, I don't know. But I like how St. Augustine puts it. It's kind of like this, the way St. Augustine speaks of time in his Confessions. William James equates consciousness also in a way that it's so difficult to explain. You know so much of it from the first person perspective, and yet it's tough to step outside and have any sense of it.
So can you say, like, you know that thing with
Schrodinger's cat?
Yeah, like where like electrons are or whatever. So is there like an electromagnetic thing where like you can't see like where it is and when that is?
Oh, the indeterminacy principle in quantum mechanics?
So is that kind of like the way that they're saying about consciousness is?
So what then is time? If nobody asks me, I know. If I want to explain it to someone who asks me, I don't know. No, that wouldn't be. But James's question, the attempt at introspective analysis, that is thinking about my own thinking, in these cases about consciousness, is in fact like seizing a spinning top to catch its motion or trying to turn up the gas quickly enough to see how the darkness looks. Oh, yes, there is a connection there. And there's a group called the Copenhagen School that spoke a lot about, at the quantum level, trying to observe things happening at the quantum level. We inevitably change them. And that's not mysterious or magical in any way, unlike the movie What the Bleep Do We Know, which took that idea and ran with it. You can create your own reality with your conscious mind. You can change reality by just your consciousness. That's not what quantum mechanics does. That's not what anyone says it does. The Secret is another example of this, where they say you can go out and change the world with your consciousness. I mean, to an extent, of course, in a trivial sense, you can. But it's not by simply perceiving and thinking things into the world. It's more trivial than that. When we use light to perceive something at the tiny, tiny level, those photons inevitably change the thing that we're looking at. And so the act of consciousness, in this case, the act of light bouncing off of the objects, changes it. But that works with consciousness too, from the first person perspective. Because if I'm the subject of my conscious thought, then it's consciousness thinking about itself, which is a weird idea. I couldn't find an image of it, so there's Picasso. That kind of makes, bless you, that kind of makes the point. I don't know. This is a nice one. This is a hammer committing harikari. Seppuku. Bless you again. I'm using it as a self-reflection, though. I don't mean this is a hammer committing suicide, but I think that's what the artist intended. And then you've got this to try to explain the stream of consciousness, which is a phrase I believe originated also with William James. This idea that it is a flow of conscious thoughts. Oh, by the way, those who came in late, make sure you see me so I can mark you here for the reflection part earlier. So if you came in late, please let me know. All right, so This quote, some of you have seen before. How is it that anything so remarkable as a state of consciousness comes about as a result of irritating nervous tissue is just as unaccountable as the appearance of the demons, the jinn, when Aladdin rubbed his lamp, or any other ultimate fact of nature. This is a hint of where we're going. It's a hint toward David Chalmers' conception of consciousness. Some ultimate fact of nature. Churchland is not going to go that route. Most materialists don't go that route, that consciousness is an ultimate constituent of nature, like mass, like space and time, like some kind of physical material stuff. In fact, most argue that it emerges somehow, or is identical to, but not a fundamental aspect of nature. We'll see the view that pushes that. That's from Thomas Huxley. And it is pretty fascinating. I mean, if you look at what a brain it looks like, it's that, or that. You've been to the bodies exhibit. Anyone been to the bodies exhibit? You've been to it? And you see that, and was it eerie to you? Or was it like, that's just a brain?
Yeah,
It didn't affect you?
I was like, yeah, that's what a brain looks like.
Yeah. And did you think to yourself, that's crazy. So I've got one of those. And then you had the thought, not only do I have one of those, that thing just had the thought, I've got one of those. And then it thinks that it's the most complex bit of matter in the known universe. It's a bit arrogant, this brain. But it is. It's accurate. It is correct. It is the most complex bit of matter in the known universe. Maybe that's something more complex that is out there they were unaware of. But I don't know.
So it's the most complex thing that we can be aware of?
It's the most complex bit of matter collectively connected in the known universe. The number of connections, the billions and billions of neurons, each with thousands of connections, giving us trillions of possible calculations per.
So we can only be aware up to as complex as that, so that's...
Oh,
that's
yeah,
it.
well, it's of the known universe, so that is always included. The known part. Well, maybe there's something more complex,
So
but
if there's anything more complex, our brain isn't complex enough to understand it?
Oh, not necessarily. By complex, it just might mean interconnectedness of of the parts that accumulate in a mass and make sense of information, or just complexity of design or evolution, if you want. I don't want to beg the question there. Yes? No? Okay. You sure? Something there. Okay. There's another dog. I'm sorry. That's a brain. Sorry, this is Milwaukee. It does look like that. It's a Shar-Pei. It's got a little Shar-Pei inside it. Why is this interesting? Substance dualism, the idea that it isn't just physical stuff that gives rise to consciousness, is a compelling view. It's compelling for most people who are new to philosophy, but many within the philosophy of mind, again, going back through most of the 20th century, were hardcore materialists or even eliminative materialists. They're either identity theorists that tell us a pain state just is identical to neurons firing at a particular rate. You read from Christoph Koch and Crick. What's Crick's first name? Christoph Koch and Francis Crick. That they want to argue that we can find the neural correlates of consciousness with a certain oscillation rate of neurons firing in parallel at particular times with particular complexity. And Chalmers responds, yes, that's very interesting and very important in addressing the easy problems of consciousness, but it leaves untouched what he'll call the hard problems. And you go back to 1994 when the first Toward a Science of Consciousness conference was convened by a number of people. One in particular was a guy named Stuart Hameroff. And he's interesting with respect to this because he's trained in anesthesiology. And what do anesthesiologists do? They take away consciousness, or at least reduce it to the point where you're not experiencing absolutely horrible pain as they cut into you during surgery. And then they turn it back on. What's interesting about Stuart Hameroff is he will admit, as will any honest anesthesiologist, they don't know what consciousness is. Which is to say, they're like my daughter turning off and on the light switch. She doesn't know how the energy circuits work. Actually, to be honest, I'm not sure I do either. And yet they're tasked with doing that. It is more of an art, they tell us, than it is a science. They do not know what consciousness is. Anyone who tells you they know that science knows what consciousness is, they're mistaken. We do not have consensus on what consciousness is. And yet, we figured out a certain amount of this kind of medicine can render this person, in most cases, there are some chances of it not working. You get too much, you don't wake up. You get too little, you're just paralyzed. You can't move or communicate, but you can still feel. You can still experience pain. Yes, and I'll come back.
So what changed that made people suddenly get interested in consciousness?
Oh, that's a good question. So there's a long history of this. Throughout most of the 20th century, behaviorism ruled the day. There were a couple of interesting books that came out in the 70s. One of them by Julian Jaynes, the Origins of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. That's when long titles started of books. And in fact, if you watch Westworld, anyone know about Westworld? Origin in Chalmers talks about possibilities of artificial intelligence and actual conscious beings. The originators of that show utilize some of the philosophical and theoretical underpinnings of Julian Jaynes' work from the 1970s, of this consciousness emerging with the breakdown of the bicameral, means the two hemispheres of the brain, when they start communicating with each other. So that book had some influence, and it was a little bit later when you start to find philosophers looking at limitations of physicalism. And in fact, you see this as early as 1982 with Frank Jackson's work. In particular, the reading you had for today had an enormous impact in philosophy on demonstrating the limits of physicalism. So that's where things start to change. And then you got reactions. I mean, this paper you have here for today was 2.5 pages. It's based on an earlier paper that was also very small. It was a great thought experiment in the sense that it piques our intuitions. It primes us to think very clearly about it. Whether or not we agree with it, we at least see what's going on. And it prompted a number of responses to it. Daniel Dennett being one of the central figures in this, who wrote a book in '91 saying, we can explain consciousness basically by getting rid of these terms. He doesn't want to say he's eliminating consciousness. He's also one who wants to just explain it in terms of biological mechanisms, brain mechanisms, which can easily be replicated in machines. And so there you start to see this drive toward understanding the human mind in a way that you hadn't for much of the 20th century. It's like the arms race, in a way. And we did see it with last administration, the BRAIN project. In fact, I have, this is the newest one. They still do it every year. They bring together scientists, that is neuroscientists, cognitive scientists, artificial intelligence, philosophers, literary people, every conceivable discipline that has something to do with consciousness comes to these things, and it's quite fascinating, the interest in consciousness studies now, including out-of-body experiences. Where were we talking about that? Near-death experiences, parapsychological experiences that we may learn something more about consciousness. And then you see we're spending less money on NASA, but a huge amount of money has gone into studying the human brain. And I suspect my jaded response to this is, that's because the funding is there, and the funding is there because of the baby boomers. What do I mean? They don't want to get Alzheimer's. And so, they're going to fund a lot of research into the human brain. I'm not saying that in a joking way, I just think that's a large part of it. That's why also Viagra became so popular in recent years. It just is. Question. I saw another question. Yes?
Does it prevent Alzheimer's?
No. Sorry, that was confusing. I put those together. No, the baby boomers are aging. And with age comes wisdom. Yes?
When we figure out how to explain consciousness in like a scientific way, will we be able to solve problems of like when you should take people like support and like when it's okay to abort a fetus?
Very good question, although it begs the question. Churchland would have no trouble with that question. When we discover a scientific understanding of consciousness, Churchland likes that question. She asks that question and thinks there's an answer to it. And that scientific, metaphysical question, if answered, assuming it can be, probably would be extraordinarily useful in issues of end-of-life care, the moral dilemmas. End-of-life care, issues of abortion, issues of, what was the other one? Taking off life support, maybe?
Yeah.
Certainly. In fact, we do have a lot of ways of looking at this now. When you have a patient who's in a comatose state, we don't know, they're not able to respond. It's fascinating, some of the ways around that. Is there any internal activity going on? Wittgenstein wouldn't be able to answer this because the person from the outside isn't doing anything, responding to anything. But we do know with brain scans, when somebody is imagining playing tennis, put them under an fMRI machine, we can tell what areas of their brain are lighting up. All right, think about playing tennis. Imagine deeply playing tennis. Person's in the fMRI machine doing this. And we can read their brain and see what areas are lighting up. Likewise, you take a patient who is in a comatose state and you have not been able to determine if there's any mental activity going on by any other means of normal communication, behavior, put them under the machine, ask them to play tennis in their minds, and if you see that activity that mirrors that which is found in the normal patients, that's a pretty strong correlation that this person has brain activity going on. It's possible that they'll come out of this coma, they're reacting to the things we say, their brain is not completely, they're not in a completely vegetative state, as doctors still to this day use. And you think it's wrong to call a person a vegetable? Of course it is. Well, why do doctors still do it? They should change that language.
Vegetables are good for you.
So there's something positive. It's good to look on the bright side. All right, so in response, however, it's not obvious, this history, I'm going to go through it very quickly here. There are those who think that, no, there won't be, to your question. There's not going to be an answer. The idea of when will we understand consciousness? We won't.
Yeah, but even if we don't ever find that answer from that research, I feel like we'll find other things that are.
That's Churchland. She agrees. Just as Neil deGrasse Tyson says with respect to defunding NASA, this was a bad idea. Most of the things that NASA discovered with the money that flowed into it were things that were not specifically related to the thing that they were intending to do. Science, the eureka moment is so often accidental. We're studying this one thing, and then we have these other discoveries that come out of it. I think that may happen with the money going into the human brain. Viagra actually was an accident, as it turns out. I think they were studying something for women, and then they realized, hey, this works for men. And then all of a sudden, its original use, I think, is no longer, I don't even know what it was, interestingly. Does anyone else know what the original use for Viagra was? You don't have to. Don't worry about it. So Colin McGinn in The Mysterious Flame says that we are cognitively closed. We cannot know what consciousness is. We never will. We're like little ants. A tiny ant trying to discover quantum theory. Will that ant ever discover quantum? No. I don't even. It's stupid. We are like ants with respect to things like consciousness. Churchland doesn't like that. She finds that a kind of Mysterianism. In fact, that's what he calls himself, a Mysterian, I think. And so Churchland thinks there's going to be a way of doing it. And she sees that this is not new, this idea that we can equate all things to and narrow them down to the atomic level. We saw it going all the way back to Democritus, and we saw it with the logical atomists in Bertrand Russell and Ludwig Wittgenstein. As Democritus says, there seems to be color and sweetness and bitterness, but really, they're only atoms and the void. I'm not going to cover that in detail. It's all matter, materialism. It's all physical or physicalism. What does it mean when I say I see a red shoe? This is in Solvang. Oh, it says it right there. That's Milo and Lola. You don't have to do that for me. Although I was wondering why it hadn't happened yet. So there, I see a red shoe really means I see an object with a frequency between 610 and 760 nanometers. Apparently that was the right answer. Somebody's phone going off? Is that your phone? Yeah. So you got your phone and your computer going off. I assume you're taking notes on the computer. What does this really mean? It really means the axons from my ganglion cells in the retina are traveling in the optic nerve to the lateral geniculate nucleus of the thalamus, where they synapse with other neurons. I didn't know synapse was ever used that way. That's like a verb. Whose axons go to neurons in the visual cortex in the occipital lobe of the brain. That's what it means to see red. Sounds right, doesn't it? What else could it be if we're not going to reduce it? It's really quite ridiculous how tiny the matter is. It gets really small. You can get down to the neurons, down to the connections between the dendrites as they reach out and they send across these ionic channels. This is a fascinating image. This is how they're able to figure out the nerve endings by not dye, but I think pouring through water. Somehow that enables, and I've forgotten the name of the machine that's able to register this, looking at all the nerve fibers in the human brain. It's incredible how much more we know about the human brain today because of technology. Yeah.
How do materialists explain the concepts of something like justice, which most people recognize that there's a thing that exists that is justice, but it's not like a physical thing?
Is there a thing? Is justice... one might worry that you are reifying a concept. Reify is to thingify, making it into, giving it substance when it is of a different category. It's so perhaps a category mistake.
Okay.
Why say justice is a thing? Justice is a concept, no doubt.
But if
Well-
concepts exist and they don't exist in the physical
One
world,
second.
aren't
So-
you acknowledging the metaphysical?
Well, I mean, let's see. Well, I've got ideas, and I can represent those ideas in words. The words can be represented on the board.
But there's more to the word than the thing that's written on the board. So that suggests...
Yes, because there's a kind of intentionality that goes beyond what our neurons are doing. Our neurons are, in a sense, in this case, representing concepts. And what are concepts? Well, you've got to go back to Frege on this one. Frege would argue that things like numbers, and perhaps even justice, although I doubt he'd put it this way, are in a third realm. They are real, but they're not tangible. They're mind-independent numbers, concepts, right? They're not like a taste that has to have a perceiver for it to exist. And we can say things that are true or false about them, Frege would say. But they're not tangible or physical or material in any way. So he's almost Platonic in that way. And that, of course, gets us to metaphysics.
Is
Bless
that
you.
compatible with the limited materialism? or-
That view I just gave you?
Yeah.
No.
Okay.
No, that view would not be.
I was just like, are concepts really like mind independent though? Like, because
I didn't say that of concepts. That's true of tastes.
but then-
That's true of certain kinds of perceptions. Of course, a concept, it would be odd to speak of concepts existing independent of conceivers, right? I mean, if there were no humans capable of constructing this concept of justice, would it be weird to talk about the planet and injustice on the planet without humans? I guess if there are animals, is it unjust for a lion to tear into a gazelle? You've seen that on the Nature Channel. You've seen it. You probably said, "Oh my God, I can't believe the cameraman's not doing anything." No, you've not said that. So justice is it seems to be, perhaps we can say that it's mind dependent as well, but not dependent on any particular mind, just some minds capable of conceiving it. Group, that gets us back to Wittgenstein's form of life, perhaps. Well, let's look at, I'm going to come back to your question because I don't think we've adequately addressed it. How do we understand traffic patterns? Told you we come back to this. So you're driving on the freeway and you're within 60 miles of LA, so you're stuck because that's where traffic starts. 60 miles away from LA in every direction, including out in the ocean. LA is a horrible, horrible city. Until they figure this out, I don't want to go near it. I mean, it may have great things to offer. I will never know about it unless I'm helicoptered in. I hate traffic so much. And I want to know how traffic, if I'm a civil engineer, that's opposed to an irascible engineer. Shake your head, that's a damn good one. An irascible means you can be rude, thus not civil. Huh? Yeah. You know what? Write that down. That's going to be on the test. You mock it, and there's going to be a multiple choice question, and you're going to kick yourself for not remembering. You know what? Seriously, somebody write it down because I don't want to forget it. This is some of the best work I've ever done. Civil engineer, and I want to figure out why the traffic patterns are the way they are. And let's imagine somebody says, oh, I know what you need to do. I've read my Russell, my Wittgenstein. I've read Patricia Churchland and Paul Churchland, her husband. I know what to do. Let's figure out the chemical composition of those cars. You figure that out for each of the cars, and then you'll know why they are in the patterns that they are. Or do you find that ridiculous? It's absolutely ridiculous. The question is this analogous to a fraught attempt to reduce human consciousness to a layer of analysis that is useless, or at least misses the mark, or reduces it out of existence? That's the question, and I'm not going to answer one way or another. You need to think about that. Is this a weak analogy or not?
Isn't that like almost like too much reduction though? Because like, shouldn't it be just like how many times the cars have stopped like prior to that and like the amount of time?
Yeah. In fact, who cares about the chemical composition of those cars? That seems totally irrelevant. Should we, by analogy, also not care about the neuronal components, the chemical electrical components of the neurons in question?
I just say like they're not the same thing. Like, I don't know.
No, fair point. I mean, it's potentially a weak analogy. And it's a thought experiment. That's kind of what we're engaged in now. Daniel Dennett likes to call them intuition pumps, or handy prosthetic imagination extenders and focus holders. It's wonderful. He's away with words. Does Dennett, still alive?
What's Den's first name?
Daniel Dennett, Dan Dennett. I'll show a picture of him later. The thought experiment is an attempt at testing the coherence, the possibility of certain conceptual ideas in the laboratories of our minds in a way that we wouldn't be able to do in a physical laboratory. And Jackson's argument is a thought experiment, and he's not the first to do this. C.D. Broad, as a philosopher in the 1920s, he had an example, actually I think, of this, in which to imagine, and it's a demon, of course. He imagines a demon, I've forgotten what he called it, who knew all of the physical, chemical properties of certain things. Would the demon, he asks, know what that smells like before experiencing it? Does anyone know what that is? Anyone take chemistry?
Ammonia?
What's that?
Is that ammonia?
Who's saying it? Yes, you're right, it is. And what does it smell like? Well, when you put those together, it smells like... no, can you even answer that? Without having experience, even the evil demon... It's not an evil demon. What does he call it? What is it?
Evil genius?
Not an evil genius. That's Descartes. It's... I don't think I brought it. It's not really important, but for fun, I want to remember. Dang it, I don't have it. Archangel. Totally different. Okay. Way off on that. Anyway, this creature who's capable of having all this knowledge but hasn't yet experienced the smell of ammonia, could they possibly know what it is like for the smell of ammonia? Does having the physical components here tell you anything? That's an inversion of this going back to the 1920s. So this is not an absolutely new idea. Let's skip that. And we saw a little bit of this before. Can these symbols give you the sound of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony? Those of you who can read music, sight read, which still just blows my mind. And thank you, who was sending me the John Gage's 438, whatever it is. Send me the, actually, I want to see the print. I should look up that. This is what silence looks like.
It's just a bunch of rests, and it's divided into 3 movements.
It's funny. Can anyone hear that music? Is anyone synesthetic enough that they can see that and hear it? I think there's a sense of synesthesia here. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I mean, if you've heard it before
Yes.
and
Yeah.
then you've looked at the
So
sheet music and then
If you've never, I should have used something different. I should have
Yeah.
just
like,
found
you
something
know
that
what
you've
it
never,
is.
most likely never heard before, put it up there, and if you can read music, would you be able to hear it in your head? Presumably yes, because that stands for something, a note that you have heard. You put that note together, you compile it in a kind of inductive fashion, you build it up in your mind, and can you not hear it? Am I wrong about that, musicians? Yes?
I don't know if this is before, but have you seen Amadeus?
Yes?
When Salieri looks at Mozart's music written on there, and he's basically orgasming because he can hear it.
Not sure I interpreted that way, but yeah, I do. I do remember that. Yes, so he's playing it in his head. And that's a good example, because he's never heard it before, and yet he's able to transcribe that in his mind. Is that analogous to what's happening to Mary, our neuroscientist? Because here we can understand, even in a room where Salieri would have to have never heard music before, but know everything there is to know about music insofar as how noises are made, of how the frequency is created by bending strings, how the notes can lead to certain kinds of melodies and so forth. Never having heard music, could anyone, yet who knows how to sight read, be able to imagine what that is like? You see what I'm getting at? This is all leading to the question that Frank Jackson's going to ask us. So, self-professed qualia freak, or qualia freak, which is a word that was invented unnecessarily, I think, just to refer to a qualitative experience. What is it like to be you? What is it like to experience any given thing? What is it like to sit in your chair right now and feel the uncomfortableness of the chair? It's probably uncomfortable. Is it warm in here? Is it getting warm in here? Are you all okay? We'll just wait a few minutes. It's going to have to kick it back on in a few. Qualitative, as opposed to quantitative. So a quale is a single sensation, the feeling, right? And the knowledge argument is getting at this with respect to one particular sense modality. Who wants to briefly give us the overview? What is the knowledge argument? Sometimes known as what Mary didn't know. The knowledge argument. Who wants to give us a synopsis? Nobody does. Yes?
If Mary knows everything about everything, all the physical and I guess chemical facts about the color red, the light waves and everything, can she imagine what it's like to see the color red? Right?
That's part of it. Yes, that's the first part of it. The question of imagination, Jackson's going to waffle on. I'll come back to that. So that's partly it, yes? And then...
Okay, so I was going to say off that, the imagination thing, he doesn't really say that any amount of imagining would have allowed her to be able to come
Correct.
to the conclusion, and that through no amount of purely logical inferences would she be able to reach the point where she is able to even think about it. It wouldn't matter.
To know what it would be
what
like to see red.
To see red, because she knows all about the physical and, like you said, chemical properties of everything, but she doesn't know how others experience it or how she herself would experience it.
And no amount of taking imagination and no amount of logical deductive proofs, if I had all the facts and I could just follow them as if algorithmically, in a deductive fashion, come to a conclusion, here's what seeing red is like. No, that is not possible. And that's what our intuitions are supposed to tell us. Go ahead. No. So here's the argument. Oh, there it is, all of it at once. Sorry. Premise one. While locked in a room, Mary knows all the physical facts about color perception. Let's imagine she's learned through black and white books, black and white video. Her skin is all covered. There's easy ways of manipulating this. A lot of papers went back and forth on tweaking the thought experiment to make it a little bit more realistic. We could imagine she talks to other people via Zoom or Skype, but without color. So she's never actually experienced any color at all. But she's learned everything there is to know about color perception. She knows everything there is to know about what goes on in the neurons, what goes on in the optic centers of the brain, and the occipital cortex. She's got all of that down. Everything there is to know about it. So she has all the physical facts. Bless you. That's what we mean by physical facts. But when she's in the room, she must not know all the qualitative facts. The qualia, the what is it like to see red? Because, by hypothesis, she has never seen any color. And when she leaves the room for the first time and sees a ripe red tomato, whatever the example is, our intuitions tell us, she learns something new. What does she learn? It can't be another physical fact because, by hypothesis, she already had all the physical facts. She learns now what it's like to see red, and that what it is like is new knowledge. If there's new knowledge that isn't physical, because presumably she had all the physical facts while in the room, it must be the case that the physicalist view of the world is flawed, because there's parts of it that are left undescribed, unexplained, inexplicable, without appealing to something else. If X and Y are identical, then they must have all the same characteristics. This is a version of something called Leibniz's law of indiscernibility of identicals. Don't need to worry about that, just I'll reference Leibniz's law again. But if X and Y are identical, then they must have all the same characteristics. It seems like they do not have all the same characteristics. Yes, I saw. Did you see? Go ahead.
So could this thought experiment be replicated today with someone who is colorblind? And then,
I thought I had something on there.
with modern
yeah.
medicine, I mean, there's that, yeah.
So,
but, like,
I don't think that's quite what you're asking. I thought I was going to be clever. Say, boom, I got an answer for you. Apparently, no, that's not quite right. Go on with your question and I'll go back.
We'll suppose someone is colorblind to the point where they only see in black and white, and then a new technology, say an implant, is
Yep.
invented
We have
where
this.
they can now see red.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, we have this now.
the glasses.
We do have people who are congenitally blind, but they have, even back in 1991, they had this, Daniel Dennett discusses in his book, Consciousness Explained, what ultimately were glasses, but there was an implant in the back that would send signals such that one could now have outlines of what they're seeing, of outlines of objects, which for them is new, never ever having seen before. The question then would be something like, well, could they know the difference between different colors? It seems, well, no, because their intuitions are that no way, they have no way of doing this. There's an example of this thought experiment with John Locke called the Molyneux problem. It was actually before Locke. And he gives an example of somebody who is blind from birth and knows their cup. Maybe this came up in a different class. I know that this is my cup, and I'm blind, and I know it by sense. Let's imagine I gain sight. Would I be able to recognize the same cup through pure vision and not feeling it? Do you see what I mean? That goes, I might be synesthetic in such that I can connect different sense modalities, where I see something and it gives me a certain kind of feeling, or I hear something and it gives me a certain kind of image, right? That's synesthesia. Do you mind kicking the air on? My qualitative experiences are unpleasant at the moment, too warm. And so this raises all sorts of interesting questions with respect to qualitative experiences, and are they quantifiable? Are they explicable in terms of physicality? Why am I mentioning this? Because there's something it is like to experience red. If you watch Schindler's List, if you haven't seen Schindler's List, shame on you, first of all. You should watch it. It's black and white all the way through until one scene. This one girl, and it's chilling. I still have the hair on the back of my neck standing up. You can just tell from just this still. I can't even talk about it. It makes you weep. You just have to watch it. That experience, you kind of get a sense of what it is like to be merry for a second, because you're watching a whole black and white film for hours, and then boom, this splotch of color pops up. And it changes your perception of the film. It changes your perception of the situation. It's an incredible move. It's an incredible piece of cinematography as well. But it gets to the point, I think, largely that Jackson is trying to make. there is something it is like that you gain in knowledge with respect to color perception that you could not have had even with all the physical facts. By hypothesis, here's a thought experiment. And this is as good as I can do. Let's say you knew all of this, and orange is the wavelength, roughly 635 to 590 nanometers, and there's the frequency interval, and you knew that. Just seeing that, would you be able to perceive what it is like to see those colors? You see what I'm trying to get at there? That's ridiculous, isn't it? Are those the two girls from The Shining? Mm-hmm. Is it? Are they really? Weird. Where do you get these shirts, man? It's cool. Every day there's a new one. It's kind of eerie, actually. That movie also gives me the chills. Totally different reason. Yeah.
Well, they all say, or the argument that he's making is basically that so Mary is supposed to know all the physical facts about color. Right?
Yep. Color perception.
Color perception.
What goes into seeing color, that's right.
And it's sort of then said that actually perceiving color is a different fact that she couldn't have known. But couldn't it be argued that seeing a color and experiencing that is one of the physical facts? And that they're deliberately depriving her of that? Like that's not, she's not actually getting all the physical information?
In a way, what you're saying is a challenge by a guy named David Lewis. David Lewis, very influential philosopher of the 20th century, and Lawrence Nemerow, and that's discussed briefly on 322. If you look on 322, Mary learns, this is first column, 322, second paragraph. Mary learns something on her release, right? She's in the black and white room, never seen color. She gets out, she sees color the first time, she learns something new. She learns something on her release, she acquires knowledge, and that entails that her knowledge beforehand, what she knew, never mind whether it's by description, acquaintance, or whatever. By the way, remember knowledge by description, knowledge by acquaintance, those are words that go back to Bertrand Russell. This knowledge was incomplete. The challenge mounted by David Lewis and Lawrence Nemerow is that on her release, Mary does not learn something or acquire knowledge in the relevant sense. What Mary acquires when she is released is a certain representational or imaginative ability. It is knowledge how rather than knowledge that. Do I want to get to that? Let me skip to this. Why she learns, if anything. Yeah, which is, by the way, something that Jackson himself will agree to and say, you know what? This actually makes sense to me. I agree with David Lewis. He agrees later on. I don't remember when. Not too long ago. But he's changed his mind about his own thought experiment that brought him to fame and said, you know what? I'm mistaken. I think the critique is that, indeed, I don't learn a new fact. It's just a new ability that I was not allowed to use your language earlier. I knew all that goes into the physics of riding a bicycle, or all that goes into the physics of catching a baseball or hitting a baseball. But that's different than the ability to catch a baseball. Most people don't have the physics knowledge. They have the ability to catch a baseball. They don't have, baseball hitters don't know the physics underlying. Neither do dogs who catch frisbees. They're able to do it. That's different than the knowing that, right? So we're back to Wittgenstein. Is that getting to your question? Because Jackson now agrees with something like that. And I think that's what he agrees with. He's a little squirrely on this, to be honest. But I think that's what he agrees to now.
Isn't that kind of like the same thing as like seeing different like shades of red? Like once you know that there's a different shade of red, you're like you didn't, it wasn't not there before. You just like, you know how that like certain countries they have like a bunch of different names for, we've talked about this.
Sure, yeah.
For different shades of red. It's like that shade is still there. And
It was always there.
Yeah.
You just couldn't pick it up because you didn't have a concept for it. It wasn't in your background conceptual framework. I get, and you're saying that that's similar to what's going on here, perhaps.
Yeah, that's what I was.
Maybe.
More what he said,
Yep.
honestly, because they kind of did differ. But his point.
That's a possibility. I mean, it's a compelling thought experiment, but if this is correct, then maybe there's something flawed with the thought experiment itself. Go ahead, sorry.
I wrote about something similar to what you said because, like, a couple things by definition, physical is related to the senses. So I feel like she couldn't know all the physical information if she isn't seeing color part of that physical.
That's another approach, and that's this guy's approach, Daniel Dennett, who I was asking about earlier. He's going to make something like that. He wrote a few things on consciousness and other things. This dude's all over the place. And if you read, it's fascinating. Read the later work, and then look in the bibliography. Pages of references to himself. It's amazing. Daniel Dennett, and it's just, wow, he's well cited, almost, entirely by himself. But I'll give him credit. He's written a lot, and he's a well-renowned. He's not liked by everyone, but he's a renowned philosopher. And he doesn't believe that there's, in fact, this conception of qualitative experiences. He thinks that could be explained away in other ways. The thought experiment for him is flawed at the outset, and I think in part the intuitions that you may be raising here as well. If Mary does have all the physical facts, truly all the relevant physical facts of color perception, then she would know all the relevant data about seeing red, including what it's like to see red. He says, Dennett does, it's not logically possible for there to be an omniscient entity with respect to all the requirements for color perception, and not know what it is like to see color. I'm sorry.
Does she only, I don't know if someone else expanded upon this, but does she only know that she's seeing red because it is a tomato and she knows that tomatoes are allowed to be red? Or if you presented her with a multicolored polka dot or something like that,
very good.
she'd be able to distinguish the colors?
Yeah, that's partly why, he said, this is Dennett, including what red is like. If Mary knows, if she has all the physical facts, color perception, then she would know all the relevant data about seeing red. Which is to say, when she gets out of that room, she would be able to say, "Oh, there's red," as opposed to "that's red." How? How could she do this? What would she rely upon? Well, because when I experience that, I'm not seeing frequencies. If somebody told her, "Here are the frequencies of each," well, then she'd say, "Well, yeah." In the same way that we can tell musically, if we know how to sight read music, those particular images stand for these notes which have these sounds. But again, the problem there is, if you never heard anything, you don't have the experiential data. It's experience, it is sensation, and the sensations which are grounded on, or the term is supervenient upon, the physical, are not explicable or reducible to the purely physical. We cannot, and we have not, explained everything when we've explained all the physical facts. Always, the theory goes, the qualitative experience, the sensations are out. They're left out of the story. Yes, and then yes.
So, you turn 16, you want to learn how to drive, right? You study the owner's manual of the car, you study the driver's handbook, you read all about driving. They still don't give you a driver's license until you've actually physically been behind the wheel and driven a car and shown that you're competent in that.
Okay.
Would that be compared to this?
That's kind of like knowing how to ride a bike. Although, you hear, just yesterday, a 9-year-old stole his mom's car, or took it for a joyride. A kid it doesn't take much to drive a car, just to be able to reach the thing. So, you should probably know what they're called. Pedals, thank you. Officer, I was just trying to reach the thing. Get out of the car. You're obviously drunk on qualia. So I don't know. I kind of, but it's not like physical facts about the physics, the mechanics that go into it in the way that she's talking about the neurophysiological facts. There's something left out of that picture. Even if I have 100% of the physical facts, I'm missing something trying to explain an experience.
What if some of the physical facts that she knew about the color red were like browsing the internet, for example, and people describe what it feels like for them to?
So that's this site kind of helps with that. It's actually a how-to for people. It's not a philosophical site, but it is just interesting of how people explain. Here's how to help somebody who is incapable of seeing certain colors or is blind, how you can describe certain things. And I gave an example here. This is not quite right. In the past, I offered this reading from Richard Wright when we get into existentialism. I've never experienced what it's like to be a black man in the United States in the 1940s. But reading Richard Wright's words on the matter could make things somewhat effable. That's the power of story. So maybe it is the case. We can explain something to someone using language, which actually that was what I was trying to get at with this. And that tells you what the thing is like. Does anyone know what this is?
Coffee.
Pungent, hot, viscous, black, acidic is... Who said that? Yeah, it's coffee. Yeah. I mean, is it? That's the answer I was giving. But now I realize I could be mistaken. Yeah.
I was gonna say like yeah, if you told Mary that red made you feel like angry, or it was like it could be related to like hot.
That's right.
Or like aggressive. And she saw it, would she see blue and be like, would she choose that one to be more hot?
That's a tough one. I don't know why I went Scottish on you just then. I don't know why. That's a tough one, lad. Absolutely no reason for that. I'm sorry. He's Australian. Maybe that's why, because he's Australian. That's why I went Scottish. That's David Chalmers. Now that's a problem. There's a version of this, back to John Locke, the inverted spectrum, the inverted qualia, as Chalmers will refer to it. How do we know that my experience of red, being able to see, is going to be the same as yours? That gets into some very interesting problems of qualitative experiences, which we're going to say a little bit about maybe next time. Yeah.
Isn't that like just an association though to say like red is hot?
Sure.
Yeah, like growing up with that, like.
Right. That doesn't seem to be. Mary, to know those connections, would have to have social. She'd have to be part of a world, a form of life, as Wittgenstein says, right? That's something that you grow up with. Blue is calm, right? Blue is also sad. I'm feeling blue. I've got a case of the Mondays. Just saw Office Space again for however many times. I have no idea. But gosh, it's such a good movie. And so that's cultural, though. And in some cultures, the colors represent something completely different. And so that's culturally, not biologically based. So that's an interesting question.
No.
Yes?
Is that just a blurry picture?
What?
Or is his hand like...
Oh, it's a blurry picture, yeah. He's moving his hand. He had his hand replaced with a claw to see what qualitative experiences he would gain from that. He soon realized this is a big mistake. I've done too much for philosophy. Some people do, of course. All right, so let's just finish this up. What is scientific explanation of space-time? What is a scientific explanation of space and time? We can look at in terms of what is the scientific explanation of mass and charge. What do we do with these from the analytic sense, analytic philosophy, analytic science? Narrow it down to its constituent parts, analyze it from its constituent, decompose it, so to speak. The problem is we don't. We can't. We presume they are fundamental, do you see? And physicists have no problem with this. In fact, we have all sorts of laws that we can utilize based upon assumptions that these are fundamental, and by fundamental, we mean they are, in Wittgenstein's language, atomic facts. They are not reducible any further. They are fundamental aspects of reality. Go back to the quote from Thomas Huxley, this idea that consciousness is inexplicable unless it's just another fundamental aspect of nature. So Huxley was ultimately, perhaps unwittingly, advocating for a view that everything, perhaps, is imbued with consciousness. What's that called? Everything has minds. Everything has the possibility of experience. Yes? Panpsychism. Psyche meaning soul or mind. Pan, all. Everything is imbued with consciousness. And maybe it's the case that consciousness, he uses experience, I think, or uses both, should be seen as similarly fundamental to things like this that we find in physics. He's looking for some sort of overarching, fundamental linking between experience and third-person scientific science. In the way that we're looking for a theory of everything in the sciences, how do you connect Newtonian classical physics with quantum physics? We need those interlinking. We need a gut or a toe. You know what those stand for? Gut and toe in science. The toe is the theory of everything, and the gut is the grand unified theory. Connecting those together. This is kind of what he's trying to find with respect to bridging the gap between the science of the brain and the first-person experiential phenomenological science of experience, qualitative experience.
So would that be comparable to the preaching of physical and metaphysical?
So would it be comparable to what?
Like, could conscious experience be considered metaphysical?
Oh, well, what do you mean metaphysical? As opposed to just part of nature? He's fine with making it part of nature. He's fine with making it part of physics. It's just that in order to do that, we have to expand what we mean by physics. Physicists don't typically think of consciousness as in the world. Physicists don't really think of, how do I put this? An entity that is studyable, a thing, right? But it may make the most sense, at least from Chalmers' perspective, he's pushing a kind of panpsychist view. Did I get to panpsychist in yet? No. It is the idea that consciousness is fundamental. It's everywhere in nature. Everything has a mind. In a way, it's a middle ground to help avoid the problems of dualism, which says there's a mind that somehow comes inseparable from the brain. How do they interact? That's a huge problem. But physicalism doesn't seem to give us enough explanation for how we feel the way that we do. We're almost done. I know it feels like we're late. Just 1 second. So we have to then find a kind of middle ground. And this notion of panpsychism is not new. It goes all the way back to Thales. There's versions of it in Bertrand Russell, in his neutral monism, I think it's called. And then you see it with philosophers and some scientists today. It has a comeback. A colleague of mine has written a book about it in defense of panpsychism. And on the one hand, it sounds ridiculous because it leads to the possibility, on one reading, of thermometers being conscious. On the other, it helps avoid a lot of problems. We'll have to end. I'll leave you with this. Should we bite the bullet and say that thermometers and clocks are conscious because they have enough information, they're complex enough to be information holders and carriers? Or do we instead say, no, we need to figure out only that which has enough complexity, and then figure out where to draw that line? Go ahead.
What's the name of the book?
That my colleague has written?
Is it available?
Combining Minds. Yeah, it's probably one of these books that's $160 because it's really only written for university libraries. Nobody's reading it. But if you find it, yeah, Combining Minds, I think is the title of it. All right, enjoy the rest of your day. I hope you, yeah. For you too. I hope your neurons enjoy the day. How about that? All right, yes.
A civil engineer is better than an irascible one.
What did I say?
A civil engineer is better than an
irascible one. Is that how I said it? I like that. I'd rather be a civil engineer than an asshole. No, I'll work on it. Okay. Yeah. All right, let me get the people who are late real quick. Let's see. Ella? No, Everardo's here. Antonia?
Yeah.
And who else came in late? Did I get everyone?
Are you kind of back to quizzes or you?
Oh my God.
I went.
That's
why didn't anyone?
We didn't.
Well,
you
we
were
thought-
on a roll, dude.
Sorry. Robert, Antonia, Lexi, Tyler, Jacob, Lake,
Okay, cool.
Tyler, Jacob, Lake,
Anyone else here?
Jacob, Everardo, Jordan. Bring them back next time. Yeah, Bianca, Lucian, Riley. Bianca, Lucian, Riley, Abdullah, John, Brandon, Blake, Miley, Paula, Ella, Isaac, Ben, James, Casey, Isaiah, Logan, Madeline, Alicia, Chase, Dorothy, and Brock.
Is there something about Mary? You have to believe that I didn't lie and look at your presentation because it wasn't up. I just
You're talking about
referenced
the
the
movie,
exact
yeah,
same
yeah.
thing in my reflection.
I know. I mean, well, I didn't know that, but I think that's, I believe you.
I thought that was so funny. I guess we have like a shared culture.
Well, sadly, that thought experiment is so popular.
Uh-huh.
When that movie came out, there's like 10 papers with that in the title. There's something
Oh,
about
okay.
Mary, and then Frank Jackson's thought experiment comes
Well,
out.
like my
but
first
nevertheless,
thought
that's good.
was after she saw Red for the first time, she like started working at a cafe where she fell in love with, goofy yet charming guy.
Yeah, that's good. No, I think that's the right inference to make. Yes, sir.
I was just gonna look at the quiz that you just took off.
Oh.
No, it's fine.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Well, I was thinking,
I can't believe I forgot to pass those back after going and getting them.
that's a bit of the water bottle it is.
Yes, leave it up. Oh, here's good. Where did I leave off? 1 second, I can't remember. I'll just say here. Yeah, go ahead.
I don't know. Panpsychism, that seems a bit like just throwing up your hands with being stringent about physicalism
Uh-huh.
or whatever, and just resorting to something to rationalize, like our lack of understanding about that. But I don't really have a good understanding of that.
Yeah, there's more to it than that. It's interesting how there are physicists and other philosophers of mind and science. Tononi is an Italian scientist who's pushing this view. Christoph Koch and Crick both had something similar to this with an information integrated theory, which is to say that if there is enough complexity and there's enough role for information to be stored, to be used in a closed unit system, right? It's distinct from something other than itself. There is the possibility of experience. And it may be that way of explaining things helps avoid the pitfalls. It helps with consistency. It helps with addressing the pitfalls of both dualism and material or physicalism. But as almost every philosophical theory about things of interest, once you develop it to deal with some problems, you end up with new ones. And I think one of the problems, as you're pointing out, and Chalmers himself points out the problem, is that you end up having to bite a bullet that seems intuitively implausible. But remember what Churchland said. And if I recall from your reflection on Churchland, you were sympathetic to her view, I think, right?
Yeah.
Just because it sounds implausible doesn't mean it's impossible.
Yeah. Oh yeah, one more thing.
Which is not terribly helpful.
There was some of the philosophers were like, well, I can't imagine that consciousness is just a couple of neurons firing off, right? But you said like 5 seconds after that, well, it is the most complex thing in the universe.
Right.
So it's like, that's very reductive, to just be like, that's not how it works. And then have it actually be, like, it's not even being like it's not even, your consciousness isn't even creating more than the sum of its parts. There's just the sum of its parts is so massive that it's like...
Right, and to narrow it down to just neurons firing is probably, in fact, the wrong layer of analysis. That is actually too reductive. And I think that's a fair point. And that is kind of funny that one might say, I can't imagine it, and then at the same point say,
okay, I want
this is the most...
hostage.
Oh no, that's all right.
Okay, take it.
Yeah, you too.